The British Rail Class 87 was one of the most defining electric locomotive classes of the later British Rail era, and, for many years, the premier express locomotive on the West Coast Mainline. Designed and built by British Rail Engineering Limited at Crewe between 1973 and 1975, the class comprised 36 locomotives, intended for both passenger and freight work under 25 kV AC overhead electrification. Closely related to the earlier Class 86, but markedly more powerful, faster and more refined, the Class 87 was created to meet the demands of the northern extension of the West Coast Mainline electrification from Weaver Junction to Preston, Carlisle and Glasgow. From the moment the first examples entered traffic, the class became synonymous with Anglo-Scottish electric express operation, reducing journey times and setting a new standard for mainline electric traction in Britain. Although later overshadowed by the Class 90, and then displaced from frontline passenger work by Virgin Trains' Pendolino fleet, the Class 87 enjoyed an unusually long and varied career, passing through British Rail, Sectorization, Privatization, freight use, preservation and export, with its survival in both preserved and overseas operational form being a measure of the strength of its design and of its enduring reputation. The origins of the Class 87 lay in the final and most demanding stages of the electrification of the West Coast Main Line. Electrification of Britain's principal north-south route had been a central element of the modernisation plan, and by 1970 the scheme had reached the difficult country north of Weaver Junction, including the long and severe climbs of Shap and Beatock. British Rail announced the extension of electrification to Glasgow in March 1970, and the project was completed on May 6, 1974. It was immediately clear that the existing fleet of AC electric locomotives, especially the various types later classified as classes 81 to 86, would not be fully adequate for the more exacting gradients north of Lancaster if high-speed express timings were to be maintained. The Class 86 was the most successful of the earlier designs and formed the logical basis for a new locomotive, but British Rail required something significantly more capable, a machine able to develop 5,000 horsepower continuously, work express passenger trains at higher speed, and also operate in pairs on heavy freight trains over the northern fells. There was another important background issue beyond raw power. The earlier West Coast electrics had suffered from deficiencies in ride quality, especially at speed. Their traction motors were conventionally axle-mounted, giving a relatively high unsprung mass, which contributed to the notorious bouncing or hammer blow effects that caused discomfort to crews, increased track wear, and also led to vibration and maintenance problems in the traction motors themselves. British Rail had already explored remedies through experimental rebuilding work on existing locomotives, with one of the key developments being the reworking of Class 86 locomotive E3173, and more directly, the conversion of 3 Class 86s numbered 86101 to 103 as test beds for the equipment that would be used in the new class. These locomotives carried Class 87 transformers, new electrical equipment, and BP7 bogies, and in practical terms were Class 87s in all but outward appearance. Their trials were crucial because they proved the effectiveness of the new suspension and mechanical arrangements and gave engineers confidence that the new class could safely operate at 110 miles an hour while avoiding the damaging dynamic behaviour of the earlier locomotives. The resulting locomotive was in many respects an evolutionary design, but one in which a series of important refinements transformed the capabilities of British Rail's AC electric fleet. Externally, the class strongly resembled the Class 86 and retained the familiar bow wheel arrangement and general equipment layout. However, the body front was altered in a way that made the class immediately recognisable, with the route indicator or head code box, once considered necessary for visual train identification by signallers, having become redundant by the early 1970s, and thus was omitted. The front end instead featured 2 large cab windows rather than the Class 86's 3-window arrangement, which not only modernised the appearance, but gave the class a cleaner and more purposeful look. The class was also equipped with only 1 pantograph, whereas several older AC electric designs had been fitted with 2, and initially this was the GEC cross-arm type, later replaced on locomotives by the more modern single-arm Bracknell-Willis high-speed pantograph. Mechanically and electrically, the Class 87 represented a substantial advance over its predecessor, with power output rising from the Class 86's 3,600 horsepower to a 5,000 horsepower continuous output, with the locomotives reportedly capable of a maximum of 7,860 horsepower at peak. The locomotive measured 56 foot 6 inches in length, 8 foot 8 1/4 inches in width, and 12 foot 4 inches in height over the body. It weighed 81 tons, 19 hundredweight, rode on 3 foot 9 inch wheels, and used 4 GEC G142AZ traction motors. Maximum tractive effort was £58,000, with a continuous tractive effort of £21,300 at 87 miles an hour. Braking was by air and rheostatic on the locomotive, with air brake train supply, and the train heating was provided electrically at 460 kilowatts, 800 volts AC. Another important design feature was multiple working equipment. The Class 87s were fitted from new to work in multiple with one another, and with certain Class 86s under the control of a single driver. This was especially useful for heavy freight workings, where two locomotives could handle loads of around 1,000 tons over difficult terrain while maintaining respectable average speeds. During the 1980s, the original multiplex working system was superseded by a more advanced time division multiplex or TDM arrangement. This greatly widened operational flexibility, since it enabled the Class 87 to work not only with Class 86s, but also with Classes 90 and 91, and perhaps most significantly, with driving van trailers. The arrival of DVTs on the West Coast Mainline allowed the locomotives to operate in push-pull formation with air-conditioned coaching stock, especially Mark II and Mark III sets, and this became an important aspect of the later Class 87 operations. The class was ordered as a fleet of 34 powerful electric locomotives, later increased to 36. Construction took place at BREL Crewe between 1972 and 1974 for the production fleet, with the final non-standard member completed in 1975. Electrical equipment was supplied by GEC, and the first locomotive, 87001, entered service in June 1973 and was allocated to Willesden Depot in North London. Deliveries then continued steadily until the last standard locomotive, 87035, entered traffic in October 1974. The final locomotive was intended to be numbered 87036, but instead emerged as 87101, reflecting its special status. This machine, later known as the sole member of the subclass 87/1, was fitted with a thyristor power control system in place of the conventional tap-changer transformer and rectifier arrangement used on the 35 standard Class 87/0 locomotives. It also had improved anti-slip protection, and because of its experimental equipment, 87101 underwent a lengthy period of testing and did not enter regular service until 1976. The significance of 87101 was considerable, as its thyristor control equipment gave it hauling performance said to be around 20% better than that of the standard locomotives, making it particularly suitable for freight work. In effect, it served as a technology demonstrator for later British Rail electric locomotives, especially the Class 90, and, in broader conceptual terms, the Class 91. The locomotive was named Stephenson after that name was transferred from 87001, and for many years it worked alongside the rest of the class in ordinary service. However, because it was mechanically and electrically non-standard, its later career diverged from that of the main fleet, and following sectorization in the 1980s, it was allocated to freight work, received rail freight grey livery, and was restricted to 75 miles an hour. After privatization, it passed to English, Welsh and Scottish Railway, or EWS, but a major failure in 1999 led to its withdrawal, and it was sold to Alstom as a source of spare parts before the remains were scrapped at Barrow Hill in January 2002, making it the first Class 87 to be withdrawn and scrapped. Even so, some of its thyristor equipment was preserved by the AC Locomotive Group, and its importance as a precursor to later classes remains undeniable. As for the remainder of the Class 87s, with electrification to Glasgow having been completed in May 1974, the new locomotives inaugurated the electric Anglo-Scottish services for which they had been designed. Their impact was immediate and dramatic, with journey times between London and Glasgow on the 401-mile route being cut by around an hour, from 6 hours to 5. The class quickly demonstrated that the design ambitions had been justified, and speeds of around 95 miles an hour on the climb to Shap was said to be commonplace, and the locomotive's power meant there was little difference in performance between ascending and descending the Great Northern gradients. When introduced, the locomotives wore standard British Rail blue with full yellow ends, and in January 1976, 87001 became the first member of the class to be named, receiving the aforementioned title of Stephenson, presented by the Stephenson Locomotive Society. In 1977, British Rail revised its naming policy and decided that the Class 87 fleet should form the new Royal Scot class, with names reflecting an Anglo-Scottish theme and often recalling towns, cities or famous locomotives associated with the route. Accordingly, 87001 was renamed Royal Scot, while as mentioned the Stephenson name moved to 87101. Although the majority of their work consisted of express passenger services from London Euston to the northwest and to Glasgow, the class was never purely a passenger fleet in its early years. Until the early 1990s, the Class 87s also handled heavy freight workings, especially steel trains and other demanding loads over the West Coast route. Double-heading was not uncommon on the heaviest trains, particularly over the fells, and the multiple working capability built into the design proved its worth. Yet despite the original intention that the locomotives would regularly work in pairs on freight, in practice the class spent most of its time on prestigious passenger duties, with much freight work continuing to be handled by the older classes. During the 1980s, the career of the class entered a new phase, as with British Rail beginning to organise its locomotive fleets into business sectors, the standard Class 87s became part of the InterCity sector, while 87101 was assigned to Rail Freight General and later Rail Freight Distribution. Sectorization effectively ended regular freight work for the main fleet, since InterCity now exercised full control over the standard locomotives, while at the same time, the liveries changed, with two locomotives, 87006 and 012, being selected in 1984 to trial a possible new colour scheme ahead of an improved 110-mile-an-hour West Coast service. 87006 carried a large logo-based style with dark grey rather than rail blue, while 87012 received a version of the advanced passenger train livery that became InterCity Executive. The latter proved to be the preferred scheme, and the class subsequently appeared in one or more forms of InterCity livery, culminating in the well-known InterCity Swallow colour scheme. However, wider developments in railway policy and rolling stock planning were already shaping its future. British Rail faced a nationwide shortage of electric traction during the 1970s and 80s because of new electrification schemes, especially on the East Coast Mainline, the ageing condition of classes 81 to 85, and the uncertain progress of projects such as the advanced passenger train. Since the Class 87 had proved capable and reliable, there was serious interest in procuring more of them as a low-risk, lower-cost option. The REL therefore proposed a further batch of 25 locomotives, initially designated Class 87/2, and the British Rail Board approved the concept in 1985 as a practical alternative to procuring InterCity 225 stock for the West Coast Main Line. As the design evolved, however, it became clear that these locomotives differed sufficiently from the original Class 87 in appearance and technical detail to justify a separate classification, and they entered traffic as the Class 90s. Built from 1985 to 1990, the Class 90 was effectively a modernised derivative of the Class 87, and would in time supersede it in flagship status. The privatization of British Rail in the mid-1990s brought another major transition. All 35 standard Class 87/0 locomotives were transferred to Porterbrook, one of the rolling stock leasing companies created by privatization, and were leased to Virgin Trains from 1997 for InterCity West Coast operation. At first, there was relatively little visible change beyond the application of Virgin's striking red and black livery, while operationally, the locomotives continued much of the same work as before, hauling principal expresses on the West Coast Main Line and sharing duties with Class 90s and some Class 86s. Yet their long-term future was already in doubt, as Virgin had committed itself to introducing a new generation of trains to replace the inherited British Rail-era stock. Once the Class 390 Pendolinos began arriving from 2002, the Class 87s began to be withdrawn, with the first locomotive to go out of service under this process being 87005 City of London. Withdrawal was slower than initially expected because the Pendolino fleet suffered reliability problems, and the Class 87s therefore lingered on beyond what had first been intended. Their farewell from regular Virgin service was consequently prolonged and rather fragmented, and a formal final day of service was arranged for June 10, 2005, when 4 locomotives worked special trains to Wolverhampton, Northampton and Manchester. One farewell working that day saw 87010 and 87002 on a normal Euston to Manchester service, but because of continuing issues with the new fleet, Virgin temporarily reinstated a Class 87 diagram in 2006 on a London to Birmingham service, and the very last scheduled passenger train hauled by a Class 87 took place on December 22nd of that year, when 87002 Royal Sovereign performed the honour. The years immediately after withdrawal from Virgin's frontline work saw a variety of secondary careers, with some being more successful than others, with direct rail services acquiring 4 locomotives in November 2004 for use on Anglo-Scottish intermodal traffic, but they were never used regularly and stored in June 2005, not least because diesel locomotives were still required for shunting in non-electrified sidings. Cotswold Rail acquired 5 locomotives in April 2005 and envisaged a fleet of 10 for spot hire, charter work and a new intermodal flow based at Oxley Depot in Wolverhampton. In practice, the venture came to very little, and only 87007 and 008 worked trains, and were both repainted into Cotswold Rail's colours before the locomotives went off lease in July 2006. First GBRF, later GB Rail Freight, acquired 2 locomotives in late 2004 as rescue and standby machines for Class 325 units on Royal Mail services, and at one point increased the total to 4. But ultimately, only 87022 Cock of the North and 87028 Lord President remained active in this role, and they too were withdrawn at the end of 2007, their final charter duty taking place on December 29th of that year, although a planned farewell rail tour did not run because of stock problems. The next remarkable chapter in the class's story was export to Bulgaria, with interest first emerging in 2006 when the Singapore-based trading firm Romic Ace International approached Porterbrook about the possibility of exporting surplus Class 87s to Eastern Europe. Locomotives 87012 and 019 were purchased and sold to the Bulgarian railway company BRC, an open-access freight operator, and preparation for export was carried out by Electric Traction Services Limited, and the transfer was timed to take place after Bulgaria's accession to the European Union in 2007 in order to reduce customs complications. Successful trials and homologation encouraged a far more ambitious deal, and a further 25 locomotives were purchased from Porterbrook by Romic Ace for resale to BRC. Refurbishment work was undertaken by ETS at Long Marston, after which the locomotives were moved to Crewe for 25 kV testing and sign-off. This project was comprehensive, involving not only the locomotives themselves, but also spare parts, drawings, overhaul documentation and driver and staff training in both the UK and Bulgaria. The export programme proceeded in batches during 2008 and 2009, with the first batch, comprising 87007, 008 and 026, leaving Britain in June 2008 after testing and sign-off at Crewe, travelling by rail through the Channel Tunnel. Later deliveries moved by road to Hull, and then by ferry and barge to Ruse in Bulgaria, and over time, locomotives including 87010, 022, 028, 003, 006, 034, 020, 029, 033, 004, 013 and 014 followed. In total, 17 locomotives entered service with the Bulgarian Railway Company, which based its fleet at Pierdop. There they became a familiar sight across Bulgaria at places such as Burgas, Ruse, Dimitrovgrad, Ilyantsy and Blagoevgrad, and reportedly saw heavy use on sulfuric acid trains between Pierdop and Razdelna. Not all export plans were completed though, and a downturn in Bulgarian traffic led to the termination of the main deal in 2009, leaving 11 locomotives effectively stranded. Those judged to be in the poorest condition, including 87, 011, 018, 021, 027, 030, 031 and 032, were scrapped in 2010 and 2011. 4 others, 87009, 017, 023 and 025, became the property of Europhoenix, and while there was an initial thought that 87017 and 023, both in working order, might find use back in Britain, the only serious interest came once again from Bulgaria, this time from Bull Market, another open-access freight operator. Accordingly, 87017 and 023, together with non-operational 009 and 025, were shipped from Birmingham in October 2012, and by the end of that year only 3 Class 87s remained in Britain, 87001, 002 and 035. Despite their generally successful careers, the Class 87s were not untouched by accidents. On February 16, 1980, a train hauled by 87007 derailed at Bushey at 96 miles an hour as a result of a broken welded rail, injuring 19 passengers, while on June 23, 1999, 87027 hauling an express was involved in the Winsford rail accident in Cheshire when it collided with an empty Class 142 pacer that had passed a signal at danger, with 31 people being injured. Preservation has ensured that the Class 87 remains visible in Britain even after the end of ordinary service. The first preserved member was 87035 Robert Burns, handed over to Crewe Works Open Day on September 10, 2005, and is now based at the Crewe Heritage Centre. In November 2005, 87001, by then carrying the historically resonant identities Stevenson and Roald Scott in its past, was donated to the National Railway Museum at York, where it is on static display. Most significant of all in operational terms is 87002 Royal Sovereign, which was preserved initially by the AC Locomotive Group and returned to mainline running condition, being fitted with OTMR and successfully tested in July 2008. In 2015 it entered service with Serco Caledonian Sleeper, painted in Caledonian blue and used alongside 86101 and for a time 86401 to move empty sleeper coaching stock between London Euston and Wembley InterCity Depot and between Glasgow Central and Polmadie. This work continued until October 2019, when the Class 87 and 86 locomotives were withdrawn from the contract, principally because of coupler incompatibility. 87002 was subsequently sold to Locomotive Services Limited and remains intended for and used on occasional charter duties. In addition, components from 87101, including its transformer and thyristor banks, survived through preservation, with the transformer displayed at the Crewe Heritage Centre. To summarise, the history of the Class 87 is the history of a locomotive class that perfectly matched its moment and then continued to find relevance long after that moment had passed. Conceived to conquer the gradients and timings of the fully electrified West Coast Main Line, it emerged as a refined and highly successful development of the earlier AC electric designs, correcting many of their defects while delivering a dramatic gain in power and performance. It transformed Anglo-Scottish journey times, became British Rail's premier electric express locomotive, adapted to changing operational practices such as push-pull working with DVTs, and formed the technological bridge to the later Class 90. After privatization, it continued to serve effectively until displaced by new multiple units, and even then it refused to disappear quietly, passing into freight, charter and preservation and export use, and the fact that so many examples survived into overseas service, and that 87002 remains operational in Britain, speaks volumes about the durability and quality of the design. The Class 87 may no longer dominate the West Coast Main Line, but in the history of British electric traction, it remains one of the most important, most accomplished, and most fondly remembered locomotive classes of all.